connection with the African Institute here at Columbia University. And I would like to remind you, if any confusion exists in your mind about the topic tonight, because we had two posters, a red and a white poster, that the topic has been changed from the socio-political consequences of the economic crisis in Africa and the Caribbean, as the white poster suggests, to race and class in Guyanese politics. And the subject tonight is on race and class in Guyanese politics. And this has been a very controversial area in terms of understanding the political and economic realities of most third world countries, more so settler communities. And racism, as we all know, grew out of the ethos of a particular culture and was transmitted through slavery and colonialism as a social export to third world countries. And this problem has dominated our society even after colonialism. Through miscegenation, the new breed that arose have come to dominate our societies. And during colonialism, the dominant race was also the owners of property. And categorically speaking, they belong to the bourgeois class. And there has been a debate going on as to what the dominant factor is, whether it's race or class. And also after colonialism, with the death of colonialism, we also find these mulattoes dominating our society. And they have also turned out to be owners of property. And so the question tonight is whether race or class is the dominant factor. Some people contend that it's race, others contend that it's class. And a third party contends that there is a dialectical relationship between these two factors. And tonight we have Dr. Rodney talking on race and class in Guyanese politics. Professor Walter Rodney, as you all know, is presently a visiting professor of African politics at the State University of New York, Binghamton. And he was formerly a professor of African politics, of African history, at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania for 7 years. Dr. Rodney's home is Guyana, and he was recently denied an appointment as a professor in the National University for political reasons, as we all know. And he is the author of the now famous work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. He has also been denied access to some of the islands, notably Dominica. And currently he is a visible figure in Latin American, in Caribbean politics. And ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce Dr. Rodney.
Good evening. The topic has been chosen to offer me an opportunity, and hopefully to offer you the opportunity also, to relate to an issue of wide-ranging importance, but to do so within a very specific context. Because the debate on race and class has in many instances tended to be carried on in a very abstract and theoretical fashion. Sometimes indeed, when the statement is made that race is more important than class, or vice versa, it is merely a statement of ideological preference or someone's conception of what it takes to be ideologically consistent. For the sake of illustration, to some Marxists who would consider themselves orthodox, they fear that to introduce the category race and to give it any valuation of importance is itself a heresy in relationship to the normal class analysis. And conversely, there are of course persons who would consider themselves as nationalists, either black nationalists, Caribbean nationalists, African nationalists, who inevitably, when the category class is introduced, see this as something doctrinaire, see it as a means of undermining their particular nationalist position. It seems to me that the debate cannot really be carried on outside of a very specific historical and empirical context. Generally, to the extent that there has been an effort to locate the debate on race and class within some specific historical setting, it tends to be within the United States. it tends therefore to focus on the relationships between black and white. And of course, if one went to Southern Africa, and in particular to the Republic of South Africa, then the debate is also about black and white, about African and European. In this instance, the example seems at a glance to be rather different from the standard formulation of the question of race. Because in Guyana, to which I will refer, the situation is one of real or imagined conflict, of real and potential conflict between two racial or ethnic groups of African and Indian ancestry. So this is not the classical black-white problem. And it seems to me, from a purely analytical viewpoint, that it is extremely useful to delve into that situation in order to see whether it allows us to have a greater grasp of the overall problem of race and class, which would normally be tackled only in relationship to black and white. My assessment of the situation in a broad historical framework in Guyana suggests, first of all, that racism, as between black and brown, as between African and Indian, is itself derivative from the older established racism as between white and black. That is to say that the situation in Guyana, in Trinidad, in Suriname, the situation in colonies or ex-colonies where transported peoples have been brought into conflict with each other in the New World, is itself derivative from the older problem of racism in plantation society. That is one of my premises. I will attempt to elaborate on it as we proceed. But perhaps it would serve our purposes if from the outset I indicated the kinds of hypotheses and the lines of argument which I wish to follow. The concept of black-brown relations, having derived from the initial black-white controversy, is one of the lines of analysis. The second is that class struggle was indeed the principal motive force of Guyanese as of Caribbean history, but at the same time that racism is responsible for important intra-class conflicts, which is a topic that perhaps both historically and abstractly is not dealt with sufficiently. Intra-class conflicts within different classes, within different strata, were in fact based on real or imagined conflict of races. And thirdly, one of the consequences of assessing our history in Guyana is to come to the conclusion that at any given stage, the existence of racism as an aspect of consciousness, as an aspect of ideology, and the existence of racism as a facet in the structure of production relations is always guaranteed and promoted by a class outside of the working class. That the genesis and the determination of racism in the society is to be located outside of the working people themselves. And these are points that I would hope to elaborate on, and in the process to bring you up to date with a sort of race-class structure that has emerged in our particular part of the world. So, to return to my first formulation. When slavery ended in the Caribbean, as many people even casually familiar with the Caribbean would know, the population was at that time essentially African-based, the vast majority of the population. And it was subsequent to slavery that a large number of other ethnic groups were introduced to fulfill the function of labor in the society. Indian immigration was the largest single sector of immigration, but we also had immigrants from China, from the Madeira and the Azores Islands, from Europe itself to some extent, from the Caribbean islands, and so on. But the Indian immigration was the largest, and the most consistent source was the subcontinent of India. Consequently, at a certain point in the late 19th century in Guyana, and indeed in Trinidad, the Indian population became, first of all, a substantial minority, and in the case of Guyana, in the present century, they became the largest single ethnic group. And that is the basis of the so-called racial division in our society. When African and Indian met in a Caribbean context, for all practical purposes, that was their first physical and or social confrontation. It was not a continuation of relations which had independently been established between Africans and Indians. And therefore it meant that their appreciation and evaluation of each other had to develop in situ. Whatever relations exist between Africans and Indians in the Caribbean were developed right there in the Caribbean. They are not relations which represent a carryover from any other type of contact which Africans had with Indians. And yet, at a very early stage of the relationship between Africans and Indians in Guyana, it was perceptible that both sides were hurling racial or racist barbs at each other. Now, where did these barbs originate? How did they develop in such a short time in the relations between Africans and Indians? In pursuing this question, it was interesting to identify the stereotypes which Africans and Indians utilized with respect to each other. The stereotype of the African was brought straight from slavery. The stereotype which in our society was known as kwashi, kwashi being a gross deformation of the Akan name Kwesi. Kwesi became kwashi in the Creole rendition of the word, and the African slave was given a series of attributes which those who know the literature on racism would readily recognize. The attributes of being lazy, of being stupid, of not, at one point, although capable of carrying on the most back-breaking work, is still, in a controversial fashion, in a contradictory fashion, regarded as lazy, regarded as given to music, given to idleness, and so on and so forth. The whole package that still, in one way or another, informs some of the racist literature and the racist stereotypes of the black man. Now that was kwashi, the African. The Indians inherited that assessment, that stereotype of kwashi. They had no notion of who kwashi was because they had not met kwashi. They had just arrived in the society, but they inherited lock, stock, and barrel, that stereotype that had derived from the plantation society. At the same time, the modified plantation society of the post-slavery era quickly built up its own stereotype of the Indian. The Indian was called Sami. That sounds rather anglicized, but what it really referred to was the title Swarmy, S-W-A-R-M-Y, which in effect, in the English version at any rate, that would be the spelling, but it relates to an Indian of a certain, of a Hindu and a person who had religious training and a religious inclination, a priest almost. Now, the word was taken then out of the names of many Indians, like Ram Sami or Vera Sami, and they simply said, this is Sami. Now, Sami was also reduced to a stereotype of a rather cunning, given to idleness also, but willing to work under certain conditions in order to advance his own aims, but not to be trusted, and so on and so forth. There is another stereotype that is built up of Sami. And again, interestingly enough, the Africans soon acquired the stereotype of Sami. So the plantation society was producing its stereotypes of these two racial groups, and because of its own economic as well as cultural dominance, the society imposed these stereotypes on both groups of working people, African and Indian. I won't go into any further detail on that, but maybe there is a broader lesson to be drawn. In many of the studies on racism, there has arisen in the last several years a tendency to want to try and find the roots of racism in some very distant epoch, using sources like the Bible, using the very earliest contacts between Africans and Europeans. And it seems to me that one of the weaknesses of that scholarship and the methodology which it utilizes is that it takes issues such as acts of individual prejudice as between white and black, or the way that a particular black is treated in European society. But it does not follow through to see where that prejudice is transferred from being a mere individual prejudice to being part of an institutionalized relationship. And it is only in the plantation society, only in the slave society of the New World, that a framework was established precisely for those institutional relations, so that the racism ceased to be merely an act of personal quirk, a personal aberration, and became instead a rationalization for a whole system of production. And this is why there's a qualitative difference between racism as understood in the New World, as it developed particularly in the 17th and 18th century, and any other acts of individual prejudice which can historically be illustrated as having occurred prior to that date. In other words, it seems to me that even after one has illustrated that racism existed before capitalism, it still remains true that a capitalist system, in a particular phase of its accumulation, in which it required to subordinate non-white peoples in a particular way, was responsible for both aspects of modern racism, namely the involvement of race as a category in determining how people had access to the means of production, the involvement of race in the actual production relations, and secondly, inevitably, the dissemination of racist ideas as a necessary part of the ideological superstructure to maintain that type of exploitation. So it is within the Caribbean, it seems to me, that one must go back, just as it is necessary, and many scholars are finding it necessary in recent times, to return to the 17th century, to return to that very decisive moment in the expansion of the European economy, when it became an international economy, to understand the genesis of capitalism on a world scale. In the same way, it seems to me that we have to look at the development of the said Caribbean society to understand the development of racism as it exists today. Now, secondly, one of the interesting ways of seeing how that racism was very much rooted in the immediate environment and must necessarily be a social phenomenon is merely to look at the way in which Guyanese delineate themselves racially, because the racial delineations are different from those which obtain in other parts of the world. All of the migrant peoples who came to Guyana were considered as a specific race. Therefore, when Portuguese came from the islands of Madeira and the Azores, the Portuguese, up until today, are regarded as a racial group in Guyana. That is a definition of race. In other words, in the Guyanese context, it was impossible to define a Portuguese who came in as an indentured immigrant as being of the same race as a white man who owned the plantation. It was essentially an economic definition. Out of the history of exploitation in the society, it became necessary, and it seemed most reasonable to the population, to refer to the Europeans as one race and to the Portuguese as another race, because their perception of race was inextricably bound up with their perception of how people made their living, how they had access to the means of production. And initially, the Portuguese, like the Indians, like the Chinese, like the Africans, came into our society as subordinated labor, as bondsmen, and that automatically defined them as a different race. This, to my mind, is a very useful insight into the way in which the racism was essentially a factor developing out of a particular mode of production, not out of any aberration in people's minds about color, because if that were so, then there would be no distinction between a Portuguese and another European. But the appreciation of what race has meant in our history and in our society has been obscured, it seems to me, by a number of academic approaches which have helped in their time to understanding Caribbean society, but which have some built-in limitations. I have in mind, for instance, concepts such as pluralism and also the concept of seeing the Caribbean essentially as a plantation society. For our studies of Africa as well as the Caribbean, the notion of pluralism gained a certain currency and probably is still current. An idea that the essential factor to grasp in the analysis of the society is a supposedly cultural entity. In Africa, it might be the so-called tribe. In the Caribbean, it would be the race. You take the cultural entity and you affirm that that entity is prior to and much more important than the overall society, to the extent that, without caricaturing the position, I think essentially what those who have held to the pluralist view have said is that there is no single society in the Caribbean. There is in fact a conglomeration of different social units coexisting in the same geographic space, but really constituting separate societies, hence the notion the plural society, and held together by a very thin veneer. It seems to me that that formulation initially predisposes, of course, against an analysis of, first of all, the ties that cut across all racial groups. In other words, it must predispose against a class analysis. And more important still, not only does it predispose against a class analysis in the general sense, but it even obscures our appreciation of how stratification takes place within the individual cultural entities, because it is presumed that the group, whether it be a race or a tribe, is a homogeneous group, and it therefore blinds us to the processes by which stratification is taking place and has been taking place within all of these either ethnic or racial communities in Africa and the Caribbean. In Guyana, the misunderstanding has been quite total in my own estimation, because it is linked to a vision of what the contemporary society is like and what it can become. If you begin with a pluralist notion, and if you insist that race is a fundamental and a cultural category that overshadows all else, then in fact it is extremely difficult for such individuals to come to an understanding of how the contemporary society is going to resolve problems that are real or imagined between racial groups. There is a certain defeatism in the pluralist approach, because if it is correct, then presumably Indians must always continue to be Indians and Africans must always continue to be Africans, and at best they might coexist amicably, but they certainly could not create a unified society with a single dynamic. That seems to me to be a limitation in that interpretation. And alongside of those who argued about pluralism was a more sophisticated and I think perhaps historically the more useful interpretation that we should understand the Caribbean, Guyana being a part of that Caribbean, as a plantation society. A society in which the relationships are determined essentially by an institution, the plantation. That institution was so powerful at all stages of its development that it in fact determines not just production, but it determines even the modes of social life. It determines even values and nuances in Caribbean society. I think the idea of a plantation and its tremendous impact on the Caribbean people has been well illustrated, and there is little doubt about it. But as a unit of analysis, it tends to be very static and ultimately self-defeating, because it ignores the contradictions, the class contradictions in effect, within the plantation system itself. It ignores the internal movement that causes that plantation system to transform itself, and in some instances to be removed from the historical stage. In Guyana, the typical historical approach that has been influenced by plantation studies is to argue that the main contradiction in the society was between the plantation on the one hand and the peasants on the other hand. And since the peasants were, in the early period of our history, Afro-Guyanese peasants, and since the labor was presumed to be Indian labor on the plantations during the period of indentureship, there has arisen in the history an artificial separation between the processes that supposedly affected African peasants on the one hand and Indian workers on the other, because Indian workers are treated as part of the plantation African workers were treated as being outside of the plantation and having a contradiction with the plantation. That, to my mind, is not a formulation that helps us to advance an understanding of our history or of the present. Because in reality, we should start with the class contradiction on the plantation itself, which was a contradiction between African workers after slavery and capital, which is white capital. That has been obscured. Our writers have transformed African workers into peasants overnight. For those who are familiar with the details of the history, it is argued that Africans got tired after slavery. They had had enough of working on the plantations. So they decamped en masse and left the plantations, and they became peasants. And empirically, this is just far from the truth. Africans on the Guyanese plantation in the first years after slavery mounted general strikes on the sugar estates. The first, and indeed the most effective general strike in the history of the country until the present century, was in the year 1841, immediately after slavery had terminated in 1838. So ex-slaves in the years after slavery immediately showed that it did not take any time to learn how to be a worker. You don't have to learn how to react in a proletarian fashion. You simply have to be placed in a relationship with capital where your labor is exploited and you respond in certain fashion. So they responded as workers. They weren't responding as Africans or as black men. They were responding as individuals placed under the tyranny of wage labor. And they fought plantation capital on that basis. The response of plantation capital was to introduce a competing set of labor from another system outside of the Caribbean, hence indentureship. The next response on the part of workers was to try and get a small amount of land on which to build their houses primarily. So they went to reside in villages. The African population in Guyana went to live off of the estate. But the reason they went to live off of the estate was to avoid the quasi-feudal relations characteristic of living on the estate. When you lived on the estate, you lived in what was known as the nigger yard. Well, when you live in the nigger yard, you're totally accessible to the plantation owner. He can come and get you at 4 o'clock in the morning. He can come and drag you out at any time. Africans decided that they were not going to live in the nigger yard, that they wanted to live in the villages. And they planned to fill the nigger yard with indentured Indians. The term nigger yard still applies in Guyana. Even after Indians were living there, significantly enough, it was still called the nigger yard. Although occasionally some people spoke about the coolie yard, but the word nigger yard remains. Now, the important point there is that Africans had withdrawn their residence because this was to sort of improve their bargaining position vis-a-vis capital. But they had not withdrawn from plantation labor. They remained locked into the system of working on plantations right up until the 1930s. It is only in recent times that Africans in Guyana have ceased to be the main cane cutters on the sugar estates. And so there is this tremendous distortion of the history which suggests that Africans became peasants because they went to live in villages. Now, I didn't know that the class distinction, peasantry, is a residential distinction, that when you live in a village you become a peasant. But this is the superficial way in which our history was approached. And it seems to me partially it had these ideological overtones. The writers were not facing up to the fact that there was a dynamic class struggle involving the African workers in the society. In any event, even after Africans have shifted their residence, even after Africans have in part diversified their labor away from the plantation, the indentured Indians who live on the estate themselves have their own conflicts with labor, with capital. Again, it didn't take them very long. They were brought in to break the back of African working class militancy, and they succeeded. The planters succeeded in so doing. But after a few years, the very Indian population brought in as the scab labor of the time became the new proletariat confronting capital on the plantations. And hence a series of labor manifestations from the 1860s onwards involving the indentured population. So really, within a decade of their introduction, because the main introduction of Indians came in 1847, 46, 47. Within 10 or 12 years of that introduction, the Indian indentured population had become a very combative section of the working class in Guyana. And therefore, I would argue that what we had in the 19th century and right up until the early 1920s in Guyana was a class struggle which was fractured along racial lines. The African workers had their contradictions with European capital. Indian workers had their contradictions with capital, with the same capital. What is true is that the racial division made it difficult, if not impossible, for them to forge common links across class lines. But this does not mean that the class struggle was not continuing, because it is precisely the class struggle that altered the conditions of emigration and indentureship and ultimately terminated indentureship in 1917, the period between 1917 and 1921. And it therefore seems to me that empirically one cannot go for simplistic approaches that a priori determine the importance of either race or class. One enters into a situation with an awareness that what matters fundamentally are the production relations. This seems to me to be what is the baseline. We start with production relations. We examine those production relations, where of course classes emerge and where their relationships become decisive relations in the society, then we follow those relations. At the same time, we have to be conscious that it has been possible within the capitalist system to create racial or at least race-class situations. Situations in which race itself becomes one of the factors located within the system of production itself, where the labor is recruited specifically on a racial basis, where access to land is denied you if you are of a particular racial origin, and therefore in that sense it creates race as an economic category itself. That when you say when you said African or black or Creole in the 19th century in Guyana, this automatically meant a certain set of economic limitations, of social limitations that were built into the system itself, quite apart from whether Africans or Indians liked each other. And of course, there is a second dimension. Outside of the actual production relations, one must take into account how the ideas developed by the society, inherited by the society, are themselves being propounded and are themselves serving to strengthen and or dissolve the system. And it is this aspect of racism which I would consider as racism in terms of manipulation that I am going to want to speak about and to bring it up to the present. That is to say, if the idea arising out of certain social relations is an idea that places races in a system of ordination and subordination, places them in a ranking of inferior and superior and so on, then that idea itself becomes a social force. And we need to identify, it seems to me, its class roots and the mechanisms by which this idea or these ideas have their impact on the society. My contention is that whenever there was, and there were many, social conflicts involving Africans and Indians, as there were, and some of the scholarship has pointed out, clashes between Africans and Indians before the modern period in Guyana, we should really look both at the ideas that were expressed by the two groups as well as their actual economic posture at the time. And we should try to determine whether a clash between African and Indian is always a racial clash. I think this is a problem of analysis that has been glossed over. People assume that if an African group and an Indian clash, then you call that a racial clash. I've been looking at several examples of African-Indian conflicts in our history. For instance, a group of sugar workers who are Africans demanding a particular price might come into conflict with a group of Indian sugar workers who are prepared to accept a lesser price. Or a group of Indian peasants or semi-peasants in a struggle for land may come up in conflict against Africans who either hold that land or hope to obtain that land at the same time. And these are simply described as racial. To my mind, that is to describe their superficial aspects. In the same way as in Africa, people are quick to describe a conflict as tribal because it takes place between two quote-unquote tribes, or conflict as ethnic because it takes place between two ethnic groups. And yet it seems to me that we have to have some procedure for determining what is superficial and what is essential about these phenomena of clashes between racial groups. And one can use some very simple yardsticks. Basically, I ask myself whether the conflict which one is looking at would have occurred in a racially homogeneous society. That's one of the simple questions which I use to try and determine whether it's really a racial conflict. If two groups of different racial and or ethnic origins are in conflict, and one is tempted to attribute that conflict to their ethnic origin, then we can have a hypothesis: would that conflict have occurred in a racially homogeneous society? Because if the answer is yes, then quite clearly the fact of race is either irrelevant or very marginal in the whole discussion, because it could have occurred between two sets of whites or two sets of Indians, as the case might be. And in many instances, this is precisely what one finds, that the kinds of struggles between Africans and Indians were really struggles that were rooted in the lopsided nature of colonial social relations, social and economic relations, rooted in the deliberate policy of creating a surplus labor market in the colonial context, rooted in the policy of deliberately withholding land so that you could hold back the development of a peasantry in the society. And within that context, workers and or peasants had intra-class conflicts, such as they would have had in any other kind of society. If you went to England, looking at English history, social history in the 19th century, there was a lot of rural discontent and localized rural violence between one group of farm workers in a particular area who go out to sell their labor, and the penetration of capitalist relations in the countryside allowed the capitalists to send to another area to bring in farm workers at a cheaper rate. Now these fellows fought each other with sticks and stones, and sometimes with more than that. Two sets of whites, sometimes from adjacent villages. Now nobody called that racism or tribalism. It was an intra-class conflict rooted in the inequalities of the socioeconomic structure. And it seems to me that many of the conflicts which are erroneously described as tribal, ethnic, racial, and the like in the Third World are precisely conflicts of that type that would have taken place within an ethnically or racially homogeneous society. What is true, and where we can designate clashes as genuinely racial or racist clashes, is where we have a racist ideology, de facto ideology, underpinning the conflict or arising out of the conflict as conscious rationalizations on the part of those involved of the meaning and significance of their activity. And the best examples would be recent examples. In 1962 we had communal violence. I think in any usage of the term racial or racist, those episodes of violence in Guyana in the early 1960s were in fact racial. That Africans and Indians got involved in a confrontation where they believed, rightly or wrongly, that they were defending African and or Indian interests. In that sense, they presented the struggle to themselves as a racial conflict. And it is important that we try to understand how it is and why it is that race assumes that primacy as an explanatory factor in social and political life. Because ever since 1962, it has remained a potent force, although not necessarily the dominant force in Guyanese politics. And it is a potent force in Trinidadian and Surinamese politics, both of them having the same ethnic structure as we do in Guyana. And that really brings me to the third of my original propositions, where I want to look at the ways in which racist ideas have been deliberately manipulated. When the planters brought Indians into Guyana in 1847 in large numbers, it would be difficult to say that they consciously and knowingly said, let us get Indians in order that Indians should conflict with Africans. I think this would be asking too much. This would be suggesting a certain planned class history, as it were. And classes do not necessarily plan their own history. In fact, more often than not, the capitalist class has bungled into its own history. Nevertheless, having brought Indians into Guyana in large numbers, the planters soon began discussing what, after all, was evident, that there was a very useful byproduct of the labor being Indian, and that is that you can divide African from Indian. And they made this clear in their own discussions. They said, not only are we getting more labor to create a surplus, not only are we able to control labor better because of indentureship, not only are we getting cheaper labor, but we have the additional, almost priceless advantage that we have created a potential wedge within the working class. And we must work on this. We're not going to take this for granted. We will consciously work to maintain that division at the level of culture, and most importantly, at the level of social action whenever that social action threatened the plantation system or capitalism in Guyana. Those were the times when the planters made it very clear that the time had come to use the rift, or to widen the rift, really, which is an intra-class, intra-working class rift between the African and Indian people. There was a royal commission which visited the Caribbean at the end of the last century, one of the largest of the royal commissions of investigation in the Caribbean. And when they reported, they carried through the evidence of a very important planter, one of the main colonial capitalist firms, joint stock companies operating in Guyana at the time, Ambakisye-Okang. They had his evidence, and he had a very explicit reference to race. He says, we consider it to be the greatest benefit that we have Africans and Indians working on these plantations. Because whenever there's a problem and the Africans rise up, a number of uprisings of blacks policed by Indians, and a number of instances of Indian plantation riots and uprisings policed by the black population. It was not until the present century that that manipulative tendency broke down, not because the planters ceased doing it, but because the living experience of struggle within the working class had by then transcended the differences which were partly rooted in economic competition and partly the result of manipulation. So that the living experience of African and Indian workers by the 1920s caused a breakthrough in that process. And in 1924, and again in the 1930s, and again in the early 1950s, African and Indian workers in Guyana made common cause. And it is highly interesting to notice that at the very beginning of this process, indeed, way back in 1905, when there was an uprising of Africans in Guyana, the colonial governor moved against this uprising. And he moved with a tremendous severity and swiftness, because they had intelligence that the Indian indentured workers were about to join the uprising. And they said this would be the most dangerous thing that has happened in the history of this colony, if we had a joint uprising between the Africans and Indians. But of course, in fact, this did occur in the 1930s and in the post-war years. And it seems to me then that we don't just assume that the racial tension, as seems to be present in pluralist analysis, is a consequence of some internal cultural factors, of the fact that Indians are Hindus and Muslims and Africans were mainly connected with the Christian church, or the consequences of the fact that Indians ate and dressed a particular way and Africans might have ate and dressed a different way. Those seem to me to be relatively trivial explanations of why the groups kept apart or occasionally were at each other's throats. Whereas if we take the vision of the colonialists themselves, we see that they recognize the manipulative element in the racial situation. They recognize that for the dynamic of class struggle to be held in check or even to retrogress at particular points, it was necessary to deliberately inculcate racist feelings in specific segments of the population. And so long as they could foster those intra-class conflicts on a racial basis, so long as they could foster that false ideology, then for so long they considered that the system would remain intact. And this is precisely what was to occur in the later years. At the very end of colonialism and at the present time, there are others within the society who are making precisely the same calculation, that the system, the inherited and barely modified system of colonial exploitation, can only be maintained to the extent that intra-class conflicts between Africans and Indians are maintained as a prominent feature in social life. But before we could understand this latter aspect, which is the contemporary reality in Guyana, we need to see how classes emerge in our society other than the peasantry and the working class. We need to trace the rise of intermediary strata who ultimately became the present petty bourgeoisie. Because my contention will be that it is the present petty bourgeoisie as a class who have inherited from the plantation capitalists the tendency to see racism as being in their class interest and to promote racism within the working class and the peasantry to foster their own class interests. Now, who are these individuals? Classes don't drop from the sky. The petty bourgeoisie emerge out of the working class and the peasantry. That is why it is no point anybody from the Caribbean trying to impress you with his or her class origins. Class origins mean nothing in the Caribbean. It's class function. Not where you came from, but where you are going. Because the middle class came out the working class and the peasantry. There's no doubt about that. Many of the West Indian middle class here can tell you their father was a fisherman or this or that, but it doesn't really cut much ice. The origins of the middle class in the case of Africans was slightly different from the case of Indians. Generally speaking, the African middle class tended to be more village-oriented because they lived in the villages. They went to school, had an education, and began to emerge as a middle class by virtue of salaried earnings as teachers and in the junior ranks of the civil service. Later, they moved into professional fields such as law. Law was a very favorite and still remains a favorite form of development for the educated Guyanese and West Indian as a whole. Medicine also. This is the typical development of the African middle class. Village-based, subsequently urban-based, essentially into salaried and professional occupation. The Indian middle class, on the other hand, came primarily out of a landed rural base because such peasantry as did develop in Guyana in the late 19th century was a rice farming peasantry. I mean a peasantry in the real sense of the word as being related to the market or being related to capital through the market and through the production of a crop as a commodity. So with the introduction of rice farming, which became important more so in this century than in the last century, there emerged within the Indian sector of the population a genuine rice farming peasantry. And it is in the nature of a peasantry in Africa, in Latin America, in Europe before that, and certainly in Guyana, that the peasantry itself differentiates so that you get small peasants and you get people who after a while one must definitely hesitate to call peasants. Even to call them large peasants is a misnomer. They become landlords, they become members of the indigenous petty bourgeoisie. Now this was the route which was taken by a number of Indians, and the collateral activity with rice farming was rice milling or merchandising, so that a large proportion of the retail sector in the community came to be controlled by the Indian petty bourgeoisie. Now there was an overlap. There were a few Africans who had a landed base, but very few. And increasingly in the 1930s, the Indians began to move, Indian professionals and Indian educated sons of millers and farmers and to some extent workers and peasants began to move into the middle class strata. So that from the late 1930s and particularly in the post-war years, there arose a competition an intra-class competition now within the petty bourgeoisie itself, within the middle class. This emergent middle class had its own competition, a competition in which the African petty bourgeoisie regarded itself as the logical controllers of the bureaucracy, regarded themselves as having primacy in the professions, and regarded themselves as the natural heirs who should inherit colonial power when that state power was passed over. Because as lawyers and as civil servants, they already had a certain degree of integration and constitution within the colonial state. And they felt that ultimately, when that state moved off, that they should take power. Meanwhile, the Indian sector of the middle class were recognizing, firstly, that they had to have some room for expansion, that it was not enough to remain on the land or to remain in merchandising, that they too were pushing to have a place in the professions and in the civil service sectors, and they too recognized that ultimately state power would be a decisive factor in whether or not they could continue to accumulate on the land or to accumulate as private merchant capitalists. As is true of any capitalist class, it will realize its interest and will realize that it must in some way be associated with the state if surplus realization is to be real. And so the Indian middle class was not prepared to allow the African middle class to assume that it would have taken control of the state in Guyana. Consequently, an examination of the 20s and the 30s and subsequently seems to suggest that at a particular juncture, the consciousness of race was not a consciousness arising out of the contradictions within the working class, but rather a consciousness arising out of contradictions within this emergent petty bourgeoisie. And that as they articulated their own class interests, they very deliberately utilized the same strategy and tactics that had been used by the colonial masters, by the actual controllers of the state, and by the plantation capitalists of an earlier era. That the Indian capitalists, for instance, one must infer this, as they did not necessarily say this, but there is a sense in which to speak about race was a defense of their own exploitative activity within the Indian community, because the Indian middle class could only have arisen within the interstices of the plantation system. The plantation system didn't give you much room for accumulating. So if you're going to accumulate, you can't do so at the expense of capital per se. You can only do so at the expense of labor, which means at the expense of your fellow laborers, at the expense of your fellow peasants. So Indian accumulation came not out of capital as it existed in the 19th century or in the present century, nor did it come out of Africans, which is interestingly enough. Primarily, Indian capital was accumulated on the basis of exploiting other Indians. That if an Indian were appointed as the driver in the estate, which is a term reminiscent again of slavery, the foreman in the slave context was a driver, he was a slave driver, and after slavery he remained a driver. When an Indian was appointed as a driver, he regarded that as an appointment that offered the possibilities of accumulation, and used it as such, partially, if he could, to defraud the plantation. But since that was extremely difficult with the overseer looking over his shoulder, it was easier to make a deal with the overseer to defraud the workers, because that was going on anyhow. He just needed to take his share. And therefore, that was one of the areas of accumulation, in alliance with things like petty shopkeeping and the control over the distribution of goods to the same indentured population. On the land, landlordship became the key feature in the late 19th century and in the present century. Most of the land which passed into Indian hands, which was owned on a large scale by a few Indians, was not worked by them. They set up certain tenancy relations, which were extremely onerous and exploitative of their fellow Indian population. And it seems to me that in order to accumulate within the community, this sector of the Indian petty bourgeoisie needed to have certain mechanisms that reinforce the solidarity of the community, as it were. It was essential that they should not have been perceived in their class guise, but rather that they should have been perceived as Indians, as brothers, because then that would lessen the potential and the real contradiction between themselves and fellow Indian workers or fellow Indian peasants. It doesn't seem to me surprising that most of the Indian accumulators were also prominent in the religious field. They were leading Hindus or leading Muslims, and that they carried out the necessary rites of charity, of giving food and so on at particular times of the year, and that they were the ones always in the forefront of defending the Indians. Now when that concept came into being of the Indians, when that was being reiterated, it was being done at a time when the Indians were already differentiated, when there was already the barefoot indentured worker on the one hand and the landowner with 600 acres who had himself moved into a new class. And it seems to me that one always, a generalization I would be prepared to extend to most third world countries, certainly to the African examples which I know, that in the process of accumulation, in the process of differentiation of a subordinated class, those who are emergent are usually the most strident in maintaining the concept of identity of the subordinated group, because that identity is itself a cover for their accumulation. No one shouted, African, African, I am an African, more than the people like Kenyatta and so on, who were at the same time ruthlessly exploiting the African people. It was an ideological reflex that countered the possibility that amongst their own people they would begin to be identified as outsiders, not as insiders, not as Kikuyu or African, but as exploiter. In order to avoid that idea from developing, or to slow down the rate of its development, it was important to pursue the notion that the community is an integral community and has interests as a community that are fundamentally opposed to the other community. Similarly, the African lawyers in the Afro-Guyanese sector continue to behave as though all Afro-Guyanese existed to serve the interests of Afro-Guyanese lawyers and Afro-Guyanese petty bourgeois. And they still think in that way. It is an automatic identification of their personal interests with the group interest, occasionally with the national interest, but in this instance with the racial group interest. And a conscious attempt to mobilize support amongst the Afro-Guyanese population in order to capture state power. But the capture of state power was not going to be shared by the masses of the Afro-Guyanese, quite obviously not. It was the capture of state power by a segment of the petty bourgeoisie, namely the Afro-Guyanese petty bourgeoisie. And they found it most convenient to manipulate racist symbols and racial symbols in the pursuit of that class objective. It is true that if there is an intra-class conflict, it doesn't mean that the class disintegrates. It doesn't mean that the notion of class has to be discarded. What we're in effect saying is that the working class exists, firstly as a concept. The relationships are established between labor and capital. The conceptualization of that is that those who are the laborers, who provide the labor, respond in a particular way and can only respond in that way. This is important, it's not choice, can only respond in that way to their relationship with capital. And that provides a link which, irrespective of whether it is operative at the level of consciousness, is a real link in the society. That's a point we can generally make. But we need to go further and recognize that classes do actualize themselves historically in different ways. The rates at which they cohere, the times at which they come together, the possibilities of their united action, the possibilities of their joint organization are all things that have to be considered on their own merit. And it is true that in the Guyanese situation, for the longest while, and still today, it remains true that the working classes have not actualized a unity at the level of organization. They have had sporadic instances of common activity, but have not yet forged a link at the level of organization, which is an irreversible link. There was a very tenuous and temporary arrangement in the 1950s, and that collapsed. And at the moment, there is still the process of trying to rebuild that link. Meanwhile, the petty bourgeoisie itself, although divided on racial grounds, does in fact continue to operate as a class with its own set of interests. And this can easily be discerned by looking at the way in which there is a selective integration of the African and Indian petty bourgeoisie in the Guyanese context. They have a hostility to each other, there is a rivalry, but there is at the same time a working relationship. Because to the extent that there is national capital in Guyana, that national capital is Indian. It exploits both African labor and Indian labor. It exploits a market which has consumers who are both African and Indian. And that Indian capital has its relationship with the state, which is presently staffed by and manned and commanded by the African petty bourgeoisie. So that when the state continues to guarantee the conditions for the realization of profit by private capital, and that private capital is Indian, that is the most important link within the class. Whether they like each other, whether they go to the same parties, whether they sleep with each other, it's really, these are very secondary, although they sometimes do these things. But what is important is that together they have a working relationship, so that the African petty bourgeoisie is at the moment, or sectors of it, because there are some other complications, sectors of it are accumulating by virtue of extending statist control over aspects of the economy, whereas other sectors of the economy remain in private, essentially in Indian private hands, and there is that alliance between the two. Sometimes the alliance is overt and open and legal. Sometimes it is illegal, because a great deal of the corruption that develops in these so-called socialist states, the ones that practice some economic nationalism and nationalize sectors of production, a lot of the corruption which goes on has to do with the fact that the existence of a private capitalist sector is recognized by those who hold state power, and they make deals over and above the formal relations that guide the state in its relations with capital. So they make private deals with capital. In our instance, recently there have been a number of scandals, for instance, in relationship to foreign exchange. And it's not surprising that who are the parties involved? On the one hand, top bureaucrats, invariably Afro-Guyanese bureaucrats, and on the other hand, private businessmen, invariably Indian businessmen. Now that is a type of link that constitutes the real nexus of that class, and means that both segments of that class are engaged in an exploitative operation vis-a-vis African and Indian working people. What is true is that there is a continued contradiction between the Indian and African petty bourgeoisie for hegemony over the class and over the state. They do compete for that. The Afro-Guyanese petty bourgeoisie has hegemony over the state, and to that extent they do subordinate the Indian petty bourgeoisie. They determine the rate of exactions which they take from Indian private capital, and Indian private capital would resent this. They determine which Indians are taken in to the collaborative apparatus. Sometimes they go and they take Indian reactionaries from the early period who were anti-colonialists, and they bring them into the apparatus. Sometimes they try to get Indians from the opposition party, people who might even have called themselves Marxists at one stage, and they bring them in also. But essentially the determination of who should come in is made by the Afro-Guyanese sector. And they usually carry out the policy which is well known over here of, appointing a spook to sit by the door, so that a certain number of Indians are appointed to sit by the door. And this is done by the essentially Afro-Guyanese state. Meanwhile, of course, they control the military apparatus, so that there should be no doubt as to who has the real coercive power. But it seems to me that that does not remove the fundamentals of the situation. Because here now we move into the stage of remedies, the stage of how one transforms that given situation. And in our present position, there are a number of people who have felt, or who do feel, that if they're Indians, that is to say, whether they come from the middle class or whether they come from the working class or the peasantry, It could be that they succumb to a vision of the society as being racial. It could be that they interpret the present reality of exploitation and oppression as being essentially an African reality of exploitation and oppression. Just as, 12, 14 years ago, Africans came to realization, an erroneous conclusion, that the exploitation which they suffered at that time was the responsibility of, quote-unquote, the Indians or an Indian government. It is only in the interest of the two sectors of the petty bourgeoisie, as it used to be in the interest of plantation capital, to promote this view. And it is a view that can be shown to be erroneous both in a sort of detached historical context for the 19th century and for the early 20th century, and that can be shown to be erroneous from the viewpoint of political action. Because the options which are available, if one takes the pluralist, if one takes the racist analysis, the options are, as presently propounded in Guyana, you have a right-wing Indian party, for example, which will be perfectly prepared to take over from what is a de facto right-wing African administration. They would argue in racial terms, but in effect, the kind of society which they wish to reimpose is no different from the kind of society which the IMF conceptualizes. And the present regime is carrying out the dictates of the IMF, so that it remains merely a change, a shift from one sector of the petty bourgeoisie to another. The interpretation of the reality in Guyana as propounded by the Indian right wing, even if it does, as it must, gain some credibility from social distress amongst all sectors of the population, is intended only to reinforce the same reality. They cannot offer any other alternative. And therefore, in Guyana as elsewhere, one turns to the producer classes themselves to see where the dynamic for change resides. In a certain sense, it's a very obvious argument. It is just that, whereas in Jamaica, to make that argument, one simply has to overcome the distinctions between two traditional political parties with no outward racial differences. In our context, it seems to be complicated by the racial factor. And it is no point simply, as some Marxists would do, as some progressives would do, it would be no point simply dismissing the racial factor as an aberration. It has historical roots. It has to be analyzed and discerned in a particular way so that the remedies can also be propounded in a very practical way. And the two dimensions of the problem which remain to be resolved, one is resolved at the level of ideology and the other is resolved by social transformation. The one is that in our society, the racial segmentation arose historically and was maintained as a deliberate way of holding down the level of wages and of increasing the control of capital over labor. That was the function of racial segmentation. It was precisely that also conditioned the monopoly of land by private capital and subsequently by the state, all in the interest of ensuring that the working class as a whole would not increase the level of its returns of the social surplus, and all a way of ensuring that the control, which was a very weak control by economic means, should in fact be reinforced by non-economic means. Now, that being so, it follows that the resolution of the so-called racial differences is not merely ideational. We can't just persuade an African to like an Indian or vice versa. One has to create a situation in which the rivalry and insecurity based on economic grounds have to be eliminated. So long as that colonial economy, that lopsided colonial economy remains, for so long there is an actual base for racist experiments to be carried out, as it were. This was proved very dramatically in recent times when the government introduced a large number of African workers deliberately as scab labor to undermine the strike of the essentially Indian, present-day Indian working class on the sugar estates. And they could do that because of the conditions of competition, the conditions of fantastic unemployment, which makes it possible to mobilize scab labor in the thousands. and to give it that racial twist. But the issue which we can deal with immediately is, of course, the issue of racist ideology, to pinpoint its social origin, to recognize it as having come at all stages out of the exploitative classes. This is not to present some naive view which suggests that workers are not racist and peasants are not racist. This is not what I'm saying at all. But to the extent that racism is an ideology, we must seek not merely its social and cultural roots, but its class roots as well. And I'm suggesting that its class roots lie outside of the working class. And therefore, from a working class perspective, while workers can be racist, within the working class it can be described as false consciousness, as false ideology, because it can be shown as not advancing the interests of that particular class, the working class. I can't go to persuade a petty bourgeois who happens to be racist not to be racist in his own class interest. If he or she feels that racism advances their class interest, well, that is how it is. But it seems to me that we are in a position to illustrate, and to illustrate from not just the distant past, but the recent history of Guyana, that race is an aberration viewed from a working class point of view, that it is maintained deliberately by classes whose interests contradict with the interests of the working class. Now that formulation, I believe, is already gaining ground in our own society, not just because people get up and say it in an academic way, but because there has been the concrete experience of African workers having to deal with a so-called African government headed by Prime Minister Forbes Burnham, and that has been an enlightening experience in their understanding what African, quote-unquote, means in terms of exploitation and oppression in class terms. So there is a basis in experience through which the working class is moving to this consideration. I will conclude then, in a way, as I began at the outset, by emphasizing that issues such as these are not really to be resolved by endless debates where people put forward their own ideological postulates and imagine that it is true because they feel it to be consistent with a particular ideology which they hold. There is a circularity about that debate. In fact, after a while, it even ceases to be circular and it becomes totally divergent because people don't even listen to each other. They just repeat ad nauseum, I think that race is more important, or I think that class is more important. Or even if they say that there is a mix. It isn't just that there is a mix in an abstract sense, but in every concrete historical situation, it manifests itself in different ways, depending not merely on the principal class contradiction, but depending on other more subtle variations of inter-class relations that might be developing. So that if one were to try to conduct this analysis for, let us say, Zimbabwe or some other place, the formulation might well be different, because the specific historical conditions that govern the so-called ethnic or tribal, so-called tribal differences in that situation might present themselves differently. But ultimately, what cannot be gainsaid is that the dynamic of class must assert itself and reassert itself so long as the system of production remains locked within that of the overall international capitalist system. There is no way in which you can eliminate that dimension. You may keep a proletariat backward or divided, but provided capital as a self-expanding value is operating in that society, either directly through wage labor or indirectly through the market, then it follows that irrespective of all internal contradictions, intra-class contradictions in the working class, the presence of that fundamental contradictory relationship between capital and labor is bound to assert itself. In our context, it took maybe 70-odd years before it could be said that the racial cohesion of the working class had overcome the introduction of indentured labor as a divisive force in the working class. And even after that date, we have had epochs of retrogression. So it's not an easy matter. But it does seem to me that over the historical run, there can be no doubt about the primacy in a class society of the class factor. I think I will stop at that point. You will be talking about
Thank you, Dr. Rodney, for your stimulating empirical analysis of the controversial issue of race and class. And you have clarified some of the issues tonight and have undoubtedly contributed to our knowledge. And however, we do hope that in the near future you will come back to talk to us on some other issues pertaining to the third world. We will now entertain questions for about 15 minutes. Are there any questions? Yes.
Well, if that question was heard clearly, it's not a new question, it's a perennial, it keeps coming up, and one understands why it keeps coming up. It's difficult to know sometimes at what level, though, that one should respond. I mean, you ask if I believe it will. Oh, it wasn't heard. All right, let me see if I can repeat it. Basically, it has to do with the conception of a capitalist and a communist society, and as to whether one believes that the idea of a classless society of one class emerging is what? Is a romantic vision or has some sort of historical and scientific merit? I take it that this is essentially what you're asking. It's no point. I could answer it very simply by almost making an affirmation of faith, if you like. But that is, I suppose, not really very helpful. I think that maybe the best way of dealing with it is for you to locate yourself in this society and to really determine where you want to go as a member of this society, and obviously as a member of third world societies, where the main thrust is in fact proletarian or peasant. Where do you want to go, and where are we going, in some senses even irrespective of our will, because of processes operating in these said countries. And if it is that you don't find a model of a society that suits you at the present moment, that is not an argument against the ongoing processes of change, because one does not have to have a model of the idea realized before one says that it is realizable. So I don't want to go into the argument in terms of the perfections or imperfections of any given model. But I would suggest that the dynamic inside even these societies, and more so our societies, leaves one with no option, because people need to do that even to survive in the present situation. When you're living in a society in the third world today, whether it be Peru or Chile or Guyana or Sudan, and you come to a recognition that after the colonialists have come and gone, the reality is that new class formations maintain the same levels of living, the same levels of culture, the same impoverishment in many ways, then it seems to me that those classes, for their own survival, are struggling to eliminate class rule. I take that to be an analysis of what is going on. Not just what I would like to happen, but I think that is what is happening. Yeah. Right. Well, the question was about the recent referendum in Guyana. referendums have become fairly popular in a lot of third world countries. The people are usually asked to vote whether they would like to vote in future. And they invariably reply no. Whether it's Sierra Leone, Ghana, Guyana, and so on. It's an amazing trend in the world. However, after the Guyanese people resoundingly voted no, according to the government, 90% of us said no, although only 10% of us went to the polls. The consequences after that. Well, I think that by and large the consequences were positive in terms of class solidarity at the working class level, because African workers for the first time in a long while became involved in a struggle, in an active struggle against a regime that they had tended to treat at least with kids' gloves because they were afraid of this other alternative of Indian domination and so on. And Indian workers too, I felt, must certainly have been reassured by the fact that they were joined in a struggle and that it clearly was not a racial struggle in any way. On the other hand, it is true that there are elements within the society who would seek to manipulate that still on racial lines, in that, let us say, the right-wing Indian parties would say to their own people, we have tried every possible means, and there just is no way under this kind of government, which will be presented as a black man's government, as an African government, of there being any space or any scope for maneuver. And so they are still trying to make racial capital out of it. But I would say that on balance, it has been a major step forward compared to the 1960s when there was actual communal violence between African and Indian, that the referendum marked a real step forward in working class unity. Okay, you win. Well, most of the large landowners came to be Indians because the commercial farming outside of the plantation economy was mainly in rice. African landowners tended to be small-scale landowners producing crops either for their own subsistence or for the domestic market on a small scale. Indian rice farmers began to produce for an external market, and even when they produced for the local market, it was so much larger with respect to rice that it was possible to have the emergence of major landowners within the Indian community. So that the largest landowners came to be Indians. Whereas if we spoke about small farmers or a genuine peasant, they could be both Indian and African. Well, maybe I'll try to answer that question in a broader sense rather than just getting into the details of Guyana. The question is to look at the alliance, the working alliance between one group, which is called the Working People's Alliance, and another group, the People's Progressive Party. And in general terms, what has happened in the Caribbean in recent years, that there has been a renewed awareness of the need to create bases of strength and solidarity on the left, to use the conventional terminology. And in our situation in Guyana, there was a brief period in the late 1960s and the early 1970s when left groups were behaving in a manner that undermined their mutual positions. I don't suppose I really need to say much about that. Factionalism and fraternal struggle between left groups is a well-known phenomenon.